So this is lecture number 4 for the 4th module of Psychological Foundations of Musical Behavior. And today we're going to be talking about comparative research looking across cultures and at cross-cultural research. So what it tells us about music behavior, what it tells us about how we process and understand music. So why do we do comparative research at all? Well, it's for a couple of reasons. One is that it helps us really understand how are humans predisposed to process and understand music. As far as, and this is a very new field, we've only been really looking at this in the past 20 years. Is it that we are able to understand the music or understand music from the culture that we have been embedded in, or is there a natural network of neural fibers that help process music? And these are some of the questions that we're asking. So one of the things to do that we learn from through cross-cultural or comparative research is, can we predict the behavior of listeners from any culture when encountering their own music? So it helps us inform how people from different cultures process their own music, as well as it explains what is happening in the brain, or what is happening when a listener hears unfamiliar music from another culture. And so we should know what the expectations are for people to really be able to process and understand music from very different or diverse cultures that, as you see through our discussion today, that if you take people from one culture and make them listen to music from another culture, they're not going to be able to process it the same way as people from that same culture. So these are things, and we just don't know where the boundaries are as far as what is human capability for understanding any music versus music from their own culture. And so we're still learning a lot about what those boundaries are. Comparative research, there's quite a bit of challenges for this type of research in general. First is that most researchers in psychology of music, most of them come from Western countries. They're either from the United States or from Europe, specifically Scandinavia. There's a lot of research being done in Scandinavia on cognition and psychology of music. But even areas where there are researchers in other non-Western cultures, there still is a great admiration or kind of interest in Western music. So a lot of the research that's been done looking at psychology of music has been almost exclusively using Western music. And so that's a bias for the researchers. And so a lot of the things that we say about how people process music, a lot of times that is under the caveat, or we think that, oh, this is universal, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's only because of the Western music, and we're using Western participants, people that have been enculturated in that in a Western culture. So definitely the bias of the researchers is a challenge for really being able to compare diverse cultures and how music is processed within those cultures. Another challenge is that with technology, Western music, in the form of popular music mostly, has really infiltrated a lot of different cultures. And so, what popular music or Western music in general is pretty ubiquitous among many different cultures that are not from a Western tradition. So, I mean, you see Western music being exported wholesale, but you also see it being melded with other cultural musics. And so, there again, some of the variables are getting commingled and getting mixed together, because we're having Western music in China and Western music in India, where we could really do some great cross-cultural research. And then also there are some philosophical problems that have challenged this type of research, and that's because some of the anthropological approaches to really compare um, cultures in the early 20th century there was a backlash saying that, oh, we're trying to say that one culture is more important than the other. So if we compare the rhythms of you know of sub-Saharan Africa with the rhythms of Germany, then one of them kind of seem like we're saying that one may be better than the other, and that's not really the intent, but it can definitely come across that you're saying that one is less, especially in the early 20th century, they would say things like some musics are less sophisticated or less developed than others, and that's not necessarily the case because music is music, and so it's hard to so philosophically, some people had problems with this idea of comparing things because then you automatically put value judgments on that, and so those are definitely some of the tricky challenges when we start looking at this research. So when researchers have gone and explored different cultures and the musics within them. They have to be very mindful of their methodology and exactly the design of their studies. And we're going to talk about this some throughout the lecture today. But you have to be very cognizant about who is participating in the study and what type of stimuli are using. We were just talking about Western being ubiquitous and all over the world now. And so if you use Western stimuli, that's not a very good choice because even if that's not part of their indigenous culture, people may have had a lot of interaction with Western music. So that's where you need to maybe choose a stimulus that is foreign to most people. So that's definitely a consideration when creating a design. You also need to think about who is participating in the study. Until about 15 years ago, most studies that looked at cross-cultural music processing and understanding really looked at one group of people. Like they would look at Americans and see how well they could process Chinese music, or they go to Turkey and how well they can process Western music. And that's what we consider a partially comparative because, sorry, there's a fly flying around and it's driving me crazy. So partially comparative, you have one group of people and you're testing them against, a foreign, a foreign music. A more appropriate approach is looking at fully comparative studies where you have two groups of people and then you look at how their responses, are they the same or different, looking at familiar music as well as unfamiliar music. And so we see that in the study you read, the Demarest, Morrison, Becken, and Jungbluth, where they took American participants and they took Turkish participants and they tested them on their memory of Western music, which was Baroque music. Both of these groups, they were tested on that, and they were also tested on classical Turkish music. But they also included Chinese music, so that there was one music that was more foreign for the Turkish, because the Western music, and we'll talk about that later. I'm going to get into that a little later. Other things that you really have to think about as far as your design is, what are you asking them to do? So a lot of research has looked at having them to make judgment tasks. Does this note fit? Which, the thing about that is you get some answers as far as how individuals can process music, but it also requires a judgment that it's not necessarily absolute. Just because people's experiences of music within their cultures is different, and so judgment tasks are, sometimes hard to really get precise answers. When we talk about emotion, um, asking individuals, well, what emotion do you hear? When you give them more choices, you get less conclusive findings. So one of the things that's hard about, and that you have to be very careful when creating a study like these, is you need to really define what the individuals are doing as the musical task. We're going to be talking a lot about Demarest and Morrison's. They have a series of studies, and most of those, how they use memory as a proxy for musical understanding. And their reasoning behind this is that there's no judgment involved. It's just whether they remember hearing it or not. And so you can have people of all sorts of ability ranges partake in this task. So as we start talking about music across different cultures, one of the things that is one of the end goals of this type of research is to really understand what is universal among all humans in regard to how they process music. So, the first question is, well, are there any universals? Are there any things? And from the ethnomusicology discipline, researchers there have really, philosophically, or just kind of as it's not empirically based, but they say, of course, there are universals of music, because every known culture that we know about, both in history and in the present, have had some sort of musical element to their culture. And so just the mere presence of music shows that there is something universal in the human condition that leads people to have musical expression and to process music. So then we get into the question about, well, what specifically about music is universal? And in the reading, it kind of goes into several of the different things that seem to be universal, which, it only requires finding one culture that doesn't abide by that kind of then says, well, maybe it's not universal. But one things that we definitely believe that are universal is this idea that octave displacement, or that octaves are kind of seen as important intervals, and that octaves are treated as similar as the same pitch. So as you go up, if you hit a note that's in the same octave or in the same chroma, if you use the psychoacoustic term, that it's seen as the same pitch class, and that seems to be something that is universal of the musical traditions that we've examined so far. Another really important property that seems to be universal is asymmetrical scales. Most scales are, between 5 to 7 scale degrees, and the steps between those scale degrees are not symmetrical. They're uneven, which, if you know your major scale, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, that's an example of that. And so that's one of the properties that seems to be universal across cultures. Now, also, recent developments in examining brain imaging and brain scanning of people listening to music seems that there are universal processes of cognition that are across cultures, and so that's and that kind of goes to, in the reading I was talking about, that in language, we know that there's architecture for language that seems to be universal in language development. So it makes sense that our brains are designed to have some sort of architecture for processing and understanding music across cultures too. So when we look into these um, cross-cultural research, we're looking at a lot of similar or several different topics, and most of these topics are either deal with, well, how is pitch understood in various cultures? How is rhythm understood in various cultures? Phrasing or organization in music? How's performance done in various cultures? And then how is emotion understood within music of various cultures? And so there are a lot, so they have examined these things through kind of different approaches. There's been infant research to really understand kind of what is predisposed in the human brain. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then there are kind of these topic areas of looking at emotion, looking at musical structure, and then using cognitive neuroscience to explain some of these topics that happened in cross-cultural research. So as I said, so we're going to spend a few minutes talking about infant research, which I find really, really interesting. Looking at what is kind of the natural predisposition of humans as young children, very, very young children, and then what is when does preference start to develop? So and you have to understand that these these studies are some of them use scanning and looking at the brains, but most of it is behavioral. And how you might say, well, how can you tell if a 6-month-old, they can't talk? How can they, show whether they prefer music or if they're interested in something more than another? So the design normally is that a baby is held by a parent, and they are looking straight on, and to the right there is, or to the left, it may be right on your screen because I think the camera flips it, but off to the side, a little window will open with a stuffed animal, and um, and there'll be like music playing. And so what researchers do is they time how long they look at the stuffed animal, because if they are interested, then they will look at it longer. So there's kind of some assumptions there, but there's a huge body of research that's built on this. So in this research, for instance, we know that at a very, very early age, that young children prefer consonant music over dissonant music. And like I said, this is how it was done. Is they would, like, this stuffed animal would play consonant music, and they would time how long the baby would look at the music then, and then they would play dissonant music, and they would look at it, and then they're uninterested in it, so then they look away. They look at other things. So that's how we get some of these. We get these findings of that. Oh, well, babies like consonant music over dissonant music because they do this behavior that we assume that shows that they're interested in it more than for consonant music than dissonant music. Some of the other things that they have found looking at really really young children is that they seem to be interested in or can more easily understand scales of unequal step size. So kind of going back to that universal we're talking about, something about the unequal step size is just more pleasant to them, and so they are more interested in it as opposed to like a whole tone scale. They seem to understand relative pitch, which we talked about in the cross-species research, that most animals do not have relative pitch. And so, pretty much from birth, if you sing a melody, they will understand that it's the same melody, just, in different pitch classes. And also that they, from a very early age, they understand um, that notes um, that notes can be similar in pitch and loudness and timbre. So they can kind of group tone sequences based on pitch, loudness, or timbre. They're able to organize them as a unit um, as opposed to hearing them as just random stimuli. Um, from a very early age, they're able to process meter, and how they did this, and this is more from a brain scan thing. Um, they would play um, they would essentially play like 4/4 music, and then every so often they would put in an extra beat, so things kind of get off of the cycle, and then they can look at the brain to see if the brain just notices that, oh, something happened there. And so they do this with very young children. They did it with children that were 6 months old, and they looked at 4/4, and then they would do weird like Bulgarian music that's in like 5/8 or 7/8 or 13/8, kind of very asymmetrical music. And what they found is if they were under 12 months old, they wouldn't notice the discrepancies in the pitch. In when there were those hiccups when they would put something in that was different. But by 12 months, they had been enculturated, which is that um, of understanding of your culture and beliefs that just kind of happens through being in a culture. And so they found that by 12 months, they had been enculturated, and they actually had a preference for music that kind of was of their culture. So, by 12 months old, Western, I think they might have been American, but I think they were UK. Babies were showing that they didn't like they weren't as interested in the asymmetrical um, meters from Eastern Europe. They preferred uh, the more standard 4/4 or 3/4 music, which in a follow-up study they then did with just slightly under 12 months old. They kind of did a treatment where they of American babies, and they played for 2 weeks. They would play the Bulgarian music for them at night, and to see if that would if that would help them understand and prefer that type of music, and it did. But then they did the same thing with adults, and adults were not. Again, I was looking at their brain when when these hiccups would happen, when there would be some sort of difference that would cause them. So it seems that very young children at a young age, they have this ability to be enculturated, even in a very short amount of time, to a certain musical style or certain elements of music. But when you try to do that with adults, it doesn't work so much. So it's really fascinating, and they talk about this in the Demarest and Patel reading that we had. So it's pretty interesting stuff. So we're going to now move over to on how they looked at emotion, cross-cultural understandings of emotion in music. And there's been several different studies, and you probably read about them in the reading. One thing that is very interesting is that when you give people a lot of options of the type of response that they think is in music, you don't get very clear answers as far as what people think it is. The research seems to kind of codify around people can generally cross-culturally tell when things are supposed to be joyous or happy or sad or grief type emotions, But other emotions, there seems sometimes there's a consensus and sometimes there's not. Sometimes, in some studies, they've shown that people at identifying fear in music, and then other times people said that you can identify anger, but it's not as conclusive as with happy and sad emotions. Um, so one of the reasons for this, why we believe that people are able to tell that some of these emotions cross culturally, is from this idea of cue redundancy, meaning that there are certain elements within the music that, or there are two types of cues that are going on. Some things are just are related to the culture, and some are just musical cues that you can kind of get from not knowing anything about the culture. And those things, I think that in the text they call them psychosocial cues. And they are things like tempo and phrasing and maybe not phrasing, but tempo and dynamic level and just like basic understanding of music, while some things that are a little more cultural specific, like the harmonic and melodic devices, you probably very much know what a deceptive cadence is. So you know when something is, a little, it's trying to be a little tricky when there's a deceptive cadence. But if you're unfamiliar with our musical tradition, then you may not catch on to what that device is doing. But also the timbre and instrumentation are really really important. If we used a pipe organ from if you are familiar with Western music, you'd probably say, "Oh, that's related to church music, or that's related to scary music." If it's playing, certain. I mean, there are all these messages that we have with certain instruments that are culture specific. So so that's where cue redundancy comes in. Yeah. And in the reading, it kind of talked about like there's a Venn diagram that kind of shows how cue redundancy works. So other studies on cross cultural research have looked at perception of musical structure, and one of these has one of the topics within this is looking at tonal hierarchy, meaning that some notes are more important than other notes within the scale, and this is another fairly strong case to say that this is it's pretty universal. And how they would do this, how they would test this, is they would play. They play a passage or they play a scale, and then they play a note, and they say how well does that note fit with the other notes. So if they play do re mi fa sol la ti do, and then come back down and they just end on re, but then if they play a fi, then the participant would probably say, "Oh, well, that doesn't really work very well. It wasn't in the scale that they played. It's kind of a weird note from, you're thinking it's going to go down to do, and then that's a tritone above it." So you would say no. So what they would do is they would look at, when they ask people to listen to their own cultures, it's very clear that people of their own cultures, they know what is supposed to what fits well within their musical style. But when they do that, when they do a tonal hierarchy task from music from other cultures, they really don't know. they have it's pretty diverse the responses you get. Also, in dealing with perception of musical structure, researchers have looked at how well people can hear or can remember. And like I was saying before at the beginning of this lecture, that these researchers use memory as a proxy for understanding because, it's like even in the tonal hierarchy task, there is a judgment there. How well does this fit? For memory tasks, it's just using using their memory as the proxy and to see whether they remember it or not. So it's nothing about whether they're trained or untrained. Which I should make a caveat here that a lot of the research, especially research done before 2000, a lot of the research in psychology of music really looked at, well, how do trained musicians process this versus untrained musicians? And in most studies, there seems to be very little difference in what trained musicians can perceive or understand that untrained musicians can't. So there's really very little, like from a neurological standpoint, that non-musicians, there's very little that trained musicians can do that non-musicians cannot. Okay, that was a hard sentence to work. There seems to be more. They seem to act more similarly than we would think, and so that's why, which is great for for research, because then you don't always have to be annoying musicians to do this type of research. You can just go to people, and since they experience music in their daily lives, they're able to do these kind of tasks. So anyway, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to talk about I'm going to talk about a series of studies that were done by Demarest and Morrison and others that really use this memory component for a proxy of musical understanding and some of the things that we learned from it. Demarest is actually who I studied with at University of Washington, and so some of these studies I was around for. I didn't really I didn't help with them. They were kind of wrapping up right when I got to the University of Washington. But they're still definitely looking at the impact of culture on musical understanding. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the one that we read for this module, which is the Demarest, Morrison, Becken, and Jungbluth, the 2008 study. And so what they wanted to see was how would people perform on this memory task for music of their own culture and music of a foreign culture. So they had a couple of hypotheses. So the first hypothesis was that the participants' scores on the test of the music memory will be significantly higher for their home culture. So for the American participants, that they would perform significantly higher on that than they would perform on the Turkish or the Chinese, and then the Turkish participants would do better on the Turkish than on the Western or the Chinese. The second hypothesis was that experts and novices within each culture will differ in overall memory performance. So again, what I was just saying about trained and untrained, they were hoping to see that between trained musicians, that they would have a better memory performance, that they process the music in a more efficient way than novices. And then the third hypothesis was that Western music will be culturally familiar to subjects from both the U.S. and Turkey. And so in the reading, there was a graph which and so all the participants, and I want to make sure that you understand the methodology a little bit. So what they did was they played 3 30-second clips of cultural music. So for, like I said, for Western, it was Baroque string music. And so they would play three 30-second clips, um, and then they would play 12 5 to 6 second clips that were either from that or they were from those same pieces, but they were from different parts of the piece. So it was really tricky because so things would sound similar, but it wouldn't be the exact thing that they heard. And that's where they really tried to choose things that weren't super repetitive, so that um, so that wasn't just a couple of notes were different; that they were really different um, different clips. And the um, the so they would present them with these 12 clips, and they would either have to put whether they heard them or not, which this is where some people could probably put a little bit of a little bit of criticism, because that's really just a 50-50 shot that they say, oh yeah, that it's so they could guess all the time and get a perfect score. Well, the statistic that they use is called D prime, and how that is how much better than chance would they get. So if they have a D prime of 0, that's at chance. Um, so um, on all of them, they did well. So all the participants listened to Chinese music, which that was definitely foreign to them. And then they also listened to their home culture, and then another foreign one. And so for the U.S., that was Turkish. For the Turkish, that was Western. So what they found was that all of them performed really poorly on the Chinese. They only slightly better than chance that they scored. And then on the Turkish music, the Turkish participants did really well on that. And then the U.S. did not so hot on it. And then for the Western, Americans did really well on it, but the Turkish did not do as hot on it. So it's kind of went with the hypothesis that they were thinking, although the Western, the Turkish, the Turkish responses to the Western music was not as high as they expected. So in another study, they looked at they wanted to see if they took people from different cultures and they put them into a scanner, in an fMRI study. Would the brain be activated during familiar and unfamiliar music? And what they found was, so they had Turkish participants and they had American participants again, and they listened to music from their own culture as well as Chinese music. And what they found is that there were, when listening to unfamiliar music, that the brain is activated in slightly different places, and there's more activation going on for unfamiliar music. And so you should read the study. The study is called an fMRI investigation of the cultural specificity of music memory. It's, again, Demarest and Morrison. It's 2010, and it's in Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience. And so they get into like exactly what parts of the brain are activated and what those things can mean. And I'm not going to get that nitty-gritty into that today. But what it does suggest with this higher level of activation for unfamiliar music is that the brain is having to use more resources to understand it. And this happens when you are given more difficult tasks to do. So definitely the brain imaging from this study shows that when people listen to music and they're told that they need to try to remember it, that is definitely a more difficult task for them, and it is harder for their brain to process. So it's just not, you know, yeah. So that's the big takeaway from that study. So another study that was done is this idea of, because right now in music education, there's this big push that, oh, we should, be introducing our students to culturally diverse music. So the question is, if we do an immersive experience in a cultural music, will that help students be able to process the music better? Because as we just talked about with the fMRI study, that the brain just can't processes unfamiliar music differently. So what this group of researchers did is they went into an elementary school. They had a couple of different music classes. I think they were fourth graders. And the experimental group where it had this immersive experience where they had a cultural bearer, someone from Turkey, come and teach some music lessons, doing some music listening, listening to classical Turkish music. They learned Turkish folk dance, which they danced to it. They listened to classical oud performances, and then they transferred that onto Orff instruments. And then they also learned, they read about Turkish folk tales and stories. So they really tried to, I think this was about an 8-week experience. So it was immersive, but it was still only 2 hours or so a week. They had a control group, and their basic, their experiences were, they did some listening activities of African music. They did an Anglo-American play party song, game. They did some traditional Orff instrumentation activities, and then they did some, other music singing and storybook activities. So, so what they found was, so they did a pre-test and a post-test. And what they found was that in the pre-test, the students perform, and again, it was a very similar memory task like we talked about in the first study, where they would play clips and then they would have to say whether they had heard that clip before or not. And so on the pre-test, they did better on the Western music over the Turkish music. That makes sense, right? On the post-test, they did better on both of the experimental group, the group that had been immersed in Turkish culture. They performed better on the memory tests for both Western and Turkish music. So they did better on both of them. However, the control group also did better. So the researchers kind of walk away from the study saying, well, this immersion experience really didn't do much. However, by giving the students this task multiple times, once in the pre-test and once in the post-test, that they actually learned how to do the task better. So they don't necessarily think that the gains that they got in the post-test were because of any treatment. They just think it was because they've had more practice doing this task, and so they were better at it the second time around. So it seems that, and again, you can question the methodology. Maybe it's not truly an immersive experience if they're only going to music class twice a week for 8 weeks. Maybe it needs to be a much more intensive kind of experience for them to have the for the treatment to have any effect on the students. And so the last study we're going to talk about today is that, and this is a really recent study, they it's similar where it was very whereas memory tasks again, but instead of playing just clips um, from performances, they played either clips from performances or they played just the melody in rhythm on a piano sound, or they would play the melody, but they made it isochronous so that it was just notes that had kind of, um, everything was a quarter note. So it took the rhythmic information away from the melody, and it's really interesting. And this is where this was only a partially comparative. It was only looking at American students, but what they found is that when they did the memory test for familiar music of Western music, they performed much better if it was just the melody, not the full performance, and not the isochronous where the rhythm is taken out, which seems like that would simplify it. They did considerably better when it was just when there was melody. So it's an interesting idea of that when we listen to music, that if we take too much information out, we can't process it very well. But if there's too much information, if you have a full performance with multiple voices playing in a string quartet, then that's too much information too. But what they did find when looking at the Turkish music, they performed equally bad on all of those. So it shows that that the information that you're getting from the melody in a foreign music, it doesn't really help you process the music very well. Yeah, and I don't even think that this study is so. I'm not exactly sure what the researchers are taking on it, but for me, it says that, especially for these memory tasks, that having too much information or having not enough information will impede your memory of your performance on these memory tasks. But for an unfamiliar culture, that doesn't matter. That's not going to help out anyway. So that's a lot of information about cross-cultural studies in music psychology. I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.